You are one of roughly 8 billion humans alive right now. Your ancestors survived plagues, wars, famines, and ice ages. They crossed oceans, climbed mountains, and outlasted every predator that ever hunted them. But about 900,000 years ago, something happened that nearly ended all of it. The entire human population collapsed to fewer than 20,000 individuals. For reference, that's smaller than the crowd at most professional baseball games. Your family tree, everyone's family tree, passes through a bottleneck so narrow that we're all descended from a breeding population that could have fit inside a single modern stadium. We came within a few thousand people of never existing at all. And until recently, we had no idea why. Most people assume humanity's rise was inevitable. We invented tools, we mastered fire, we built civilizations. The story we tell ourselves is one of constant growth and progress. But the genetic evidence tells a different story. Written in your DNA right now is a scar from a near-extinction event so catastrophic that it lasted for more than 100,000 years. This wasn't a close call that passed in a generation. This was a millennial-scale collapse that brought our species to the edge of oblivion and kept it there for longer than all of recorded human history. The first clue came in 1991, but nobody understood what they were looking at. Geneticist Lee Jean and his colleagues at the University of Texas were studying human mitochondrial DNA, the genetic material passed directly from mother to child with almost no variation. They were trying to map how long ago different human populations diverged from one another. What they found didn't make sense. The genetic diversity in modern humans was far lower than it should have been. We had less variation than most other mammal species, sometimes dramatically less. Chimpanzees, our closest living relatives, have roughly twice the genetic diversity humans do. And they live in a fraction of the habitat we occupy. This was strange. Humans are spread across every continent. We live in deserts, rainforests, tundras, and islands. We should be one of the most genetically diverse species on the planet. Instead, we look like a species that went through a severe population crash. Something had cut our numbers so drastically that only a tiny fraction of the genetic variation that once existed made it through to the other side. By the early 2000s, researchers had a term for this: the bottleneck. Multiple independent studies using different genetic markers kept arriving at the same conclusion. Somewhere deep in our past, the human population had collapsed. The estimates varied slightly depending on the method, but the pattern was undeniable. At some point before modern humans spread out of Africa, our ancestors had been reduced to a remnant population so small that everyone alive today is descended from them. In 2008, a team led by population geneticist Chad Huff at the University of Utah published a paper in the American Journal of Human Genetics. They analyzed genetic data from diverse populations around the world and calculated the size of the ancestral breeding population at different points in history. Their conclusion was striking. Around 70,000 years ago, the effective human population, meaning the number of individuals successfully reproducing, had dropped to somewhere between 3,000 and 10,000 people. Other studies pushed the timeline back further. In 2010, researchers analyzing different sections of the genome found evidence of an even earlier bottleneck, potentially as far back as 1.2 million years ago. The data was complicated. Human evolution isn't a straight line. Our ancestors interbred with other hominin species. Populations expanded and contracted across hundreds of thousands of years. But every analysis kept circling back to the same reality. At multiple points in our history, humanity was hanging by a thread. But here's what nobody could figure out. What actually caused it? A population crash that severe doesn't just happen. Something catastrophic had to have occurred. And for more than 2 decades, scientists proposed theory after theory, each one trying to explain how our ancestors were pushed to the brink. The first suspect was climate. The Earth's climate over the past million years has been violently unstable. Ice ages came and went. Sea levels rose and fell by hundreds of feet. Entire ecosystems appeared and vanished within a few thousand years. Around 70,000 years ago, one event in particular seemed like a perfect candidate. Mount Toba, a supervolcano in Indonesia, erupted with a force so massive it ejected more than 600 cubic miles of rock and ash into the atmosphere. It was one of the largest volcanic eruptions in the past 2 million years. Anthropologist Stanley Ambrose at the University of Illinois proposed in 1998 that the Toba eruption triggered a volcanic winter that lasted for years. Ash blocked the sun. Temperatures plummeted. Plant life died off across vast regions. And the small populations of early humans scattered across Africa and Asia were decimated. The timing lined up almost perfectly with the genetic bottleneck. For years, this was the leading explanation. The story made sense. A natural disaster big enough to explain a global collapse. But then the evidence started to fall apart. Archaeologists working in India found stone tools in sediment layers directly above and below the Toba ash. The tools didn't change. Whoever was making them before the eruption kept making them afterward. There was no gap in occupation. No sign of mass death. More troubling, climate records from the period didn't show the prolonged global winter Ambrose's theory required. There was cooling, yes, but nothing sustained enough to collapse ecosystems worldwide. Other researchers pointed to the Ice Age cycles themselves. Around 900,000 years ago, the Earth's climate shifted into a pattern of extreme glaciations. Ice sheets expanded across the northern hemisphere. Africa, where most human ancestors lived, didn't freeze, but it dried out. Forests shrank. Grasslands turned to desert. Water sources disappeared. A species dependent on specific environments would have been forced into smaller and smaller refuges. This could explain a prolonged bottleneck. Not a single catastrophic event, but a grinding environmental pressure that lasted for tens of thousands of years. And then in 2023, everything changed. A team of researchers led by Wang Jiehu and Yisuan Pan in China published a paper in the journal Science that rewrote the entire story. They had developed a new computational method called FITCOL, Fast Infinitesimal Time Coalescent Analysis, designed to detect ancient population changes with far greater precision than previous techniques. They fed it genomic data from 3,154 present-day humans representing populations from around the world. And what came back was more specific and more disturbing than anyone expected. The bottleneck didn't happen 70,000 years ago. It happened much earlier. Around 930,000 years ago, the human population crashed to approximately 1,280 breeding individuals. And it stayed there for 117,000 years. Read that again. 117,000 years. That's not a temporary crisis. That's not a single disaster followed by recovery. That's longer than modern Homo sapiens have existed as a species. For more than 100 millennia, our ancestors lived on the edge of extinction. Generation after generation born into a world where humanity consisted of maybe 10,000 to 20,000 total individuals spread across the entire African continent. The researchers calculated that during this period, humanity lost roughly 98.7% of its ancestral population. Nearly everyone died. And the few who survived became the genetic ancestors of every human being alive today. Every person you've ever met, every historical figure, every stranger on the street, all of us descend from that tiny group of survivors. But here's where it gets even stranger. The timing of this bottleneck overlaps almost perfectly with a gap in the fossil record. Between roughly 950,000 and 650,000 years ago, hominin fossils in Africa become extremely rare. For years, paleoanthropologists assumed this was just bad luck. Fossils are hard to form and harder to find. But the genetic data suggests something else. The fossils are rare because the people were rare. There was almost nobody left to fossilize. Hu and his team proposed a cause, and it's the same one earlier researchers had suspected. Climate. But not a single volcanic eruption. Not one ice age. Something worse. Around 900,000 years ago, the Earth entered a period of extreme glacial cycling. The climate didn't just get colder. It became unpredictable. Temperatures swung wildly. Wet periods turned to droughts that lasted for thousands of years. In Africa, where early humans lived, this meant the slow disappearance of stable water sources and the collapse of the ecosystems they depended on. Early humans weren't adaptable the way modern humans are. They couldn't farm. They couldn't store food for years at a time. They couldn't build infrastructure to survive extended droughts. They were hunter-gatherers dependent on specific plants and animals that were themselves disappearing. When the environment contracted, so did they. And the contraction was so severe that it nearly finished them. But they didn't go extinct. Somehow, a small population survived. And this is the part that changes everything we thought we knew about human evolution. Because the humans who entered the bottleneck 930,000 years ago were not the same species as the ones who came out the other side. The researchers found something in the genetic data they hadn't expected. During the bottleneck period, the rate of genetic mutations and recombinations increased. Small populations typically lose genetic diversity because there are fewer individuals to carry variations. But if that small population is isolated for long enough and faces extreme selective pressure, evolution can accelerate. Traits that would have been rare in a large population can become universal in a small one within a few thousand years. This matches what we see in the fossil record on the other side of the gap. Around 600,000 years ago, hominin fossils start appearing again, and they look different. Brain sizes are larger. Tool use is more sophisticated. There's evidence of controlled fire use becoming widespread. The species that emerged from the bottleneck had changed. Some researchers now believe this period gave rise to the last common ancestor of three separate hominin lineages: Homo sapiens, modern humans; Neanderthals, who would later spread into Europe and Asia; and Denisovans, a mysterious group we know mostly from DNA. All three of these species share genetic signatures consistent with descending from a small ancestral population that survived the bottleneck. In other words, the near extinction of humanity 900,000 years ago may have been the event that created the conditions for modern humans to evolve in the first place. There's a term for this in evolutionary biology: punctuated equilibrium. Long periods of stability interrupted by rapid bursts of change. The bottleneck was the interruption. And what came after was us. But the existential weight of this sits differently when you understand the scale. For 117,000 years, your ancestors lived in a population smaller than a modern town. They watched the world they knew dry up and blow away. They lost languages, cultures, technologies that we'll never recover because there was nobody left to pass them on. Entire lineages of humans vanished. Genetic variations that had existed for hundreds of thousands of years were erased. You exist because a group of fewer than 2,000 people, facing conditions that killed almost everyone else, refused to stop reproducing. They didn't know they were saving the species. They didn't have a concept of species. They were just trying to survive one more generation. And they did it for 117,000 years. We like to think of human history as progress. A steady climb from primitive origins to modern civilization. But the genetic evidence shows something messier. We are not the inevitable result of evolution's plan. We are the unlikely descendants of a remnant population that survived something so catastrophic it erased most of the evidence that it ever happened. And here's the uncomfortable part. It could happen again. Not the same way, not from the same cause. But the mechanisms that nearly wiped us out, climate instability, resource collapse, population fragmentation, all of them still exist. We've built civilizations that make us feel insulated from extinction. But 900,000 years ago, our ancestors thought they were safe too. And then the water stopped coming. And the food disappeared. And 98.7% of them died. You're only here because they weren't.